Hey everyone, welcome to my talk about ASP.NET Core Beyond the Introduction. I hope that is what you're here to attend, because that is what I'm going to be talking about. And the goal is to cover some of the things that we normally maybe don't see at conferences about ASP.NET Core. So it's not going to be your introductory talk, and hopefully, or I can pretty much guarantee that I think everyone will leave this talk with at least having seen something they haven't seen before. But before I get started, I just want to tell you my name is Klug. I work as a software developer at a company called Active Solution in Stockholm, Sweden. And I spend most of my time doing software development for web scenarios mostly and cloud. And I also do a bunch of public speaking. So I enjoy going around and telling people the things that I've learned along the way and then picking up what everyone else has learned as well so we can share the knowledge we've learned along the way. I've also been an MVP for the last 9 years, counting, I think it is, and it's given me sort of an interesting view into ASP.NET Core and the things you can do in there, which is kind of what I'm trying to bring with this talk here as well. But you're not here to listen about me, so I'm going to show demos. So it's basically just demos all the way through. There's only one more slide at the end, but let's just go and jump straight into Visual Studio. So I'm going to show a couple of different demos here. And I'm going to start off by having this initial application. I should have pre-built that, but here it is, called Awesome Source Company. And Awesome Source Company has some employees. And when you go into look at these employees, you can see what they've done and who they are. And you get this URL up here that says localhost /users/2. And for one, we've got there. So that's your regular ASP.NET routing. You get users/ and then the ID of whatever you want to view, which is kind of not the greatest experience, and it's not very good for search engines. So I would like this to be more of a search engine-based approach, where it's like /HeadyLamar, and I can go to that. And there are ways to do that. There are NuGet packages that will do it, but it's actually not that hard to build something like that on your own. So let's have a look at the startup file for this application. As you can see, it's just a pure ASP.NET Core application with controllers, with views. And what we can do in ASP.NET Core, which most of you potentially already know, is that you can jump straight into configure here, and you can actually attach to the incoming and outgoing requests. So I can go and say that. As you can see here, I have I need one more thing, sorry. I need to pull in a little repo here called users. I have a repository for users, and in the request here, so whenever a request comes into the web server, it goes through all of these middlewares, and I just added my own middleware here. So if it's not a static file that's being used, the request is going to come into my callback here. And I'm just going to check to see if there's actually a path. If somebody did go to just /, then I don't want to touch it. But if there is something after the /, I want to go ahead and actually look at the URL that's being passed in, or the path that's being passed in. And then I look at the path and I verify that it's more than just a /. And then based on the path that I'm getting in, I cut off the first /. So I just get the path without the first /. And then I ask my users repository, can you please get me a user with the name based on the path that's being passed in? But here's the cool thing. This is the really important part that I want to highlight. And that's the fact that I can rewrite my request. So coming in, I can easily write a middleware that goes into the HTTP context to the request object and just rewrites the path. So most of the properties on request, the request objects and so on, are get set. So I can rewrite this. So whenever a middleware, when it comes in, the request comes from my middleware, when it passes out and I call the next part here, I might have rewritten it, but nobody actually really knows that I rewrote the path, because once it gets to the routing part and it gets to the endpoints part and it ends up in the controllers, they are just going to see that old URL, which is going to be users/ID. If I go back out here to this thing here, my old address still works. That works fine, but I can also go and say AdditionalDependencies like that, and apparently I can't. Why? Did that not work? Sorry, wrong button. Let's restart that thing and then go to /HeadyLamar. And apparently this is starting out really well. I've got startup in that thing here. Let's try this. Why am I all of a sudden not getting any requests coming through at all? That's interesting, because now I'm not getting anything at all. This is starting out great. Sorry about that, guys. I'm working on it. So that comes in here. My path is slash. That's fine. Shouldn't touch that. I should go to slash heady. Is it because I'm spelling it wrong? Lamar. Go to heady Lamar. Whenever I go to heady Lamar, I get a connection refused. So I just remove. Sorry, give me one last try here, and then I'm going to give up. I think I know where it is. Slash heady Lamar. There it is. I'm apparently spelling it wrong. Sorry. So that now ends up with, if I look at here, it comes in, looks at my path, which is going to be heady Lamar. It takes the heady Lamar part, replaces the dash with a space, and then it asks for a user with that name, then replaces it. So if I put in a breakpoint here, we have a look at my call here, to slash, let's just carry on with that, to slash heady dash Lamar. When I come in here, the request path is going to be heady Lamar. I go through F10, I go through all these steps. You can see I can just go in and rewrite it. The request path is now slash user slash one, and whenever I call next, it's going to be that, and it's going to work. Besides me screwing up spelling, this is pretty cool. It's a very nice way to hack into a very low-level interface or API of ASP.NET Core and actually modify requests both coming in and going out. But I'm not a huge fan of putting in middlewares like this. We really should be putting in our middlewares in a nicer way. So for those of you who haven't looked at building your own custom middlewares, it's actually not that hard. You're just going to pull up a middlewares folder, and I'm going to add a new class in here, and I'm going to call it name routing middleware, like that. So a middleware is basically something that looks like this. So it's a class. It doesn't have to implement an interface. It doesn't inherit from a base class. All it really needs, it needs a constructor that takes a request delegate, and it needs a method called invoke async that returns task and takes an HTTP context. Pretty much everything you need for a middleware. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move my code into this middleware and have it reusable. So I'm going to start out by, I'm going to pull in my users repository like that. And I have an issue with it needing to be like that. And then down here, I can go ahead and I can basically just go and say name routing middleware invoke async. So this code here, if you have a look at this code, it's pretty much identical to the code I just had in my startup. I just moved it from being inline in my startup, which if you have a lot of middlewares, your startup file becomes this big unwieldy thing. But having it in a separate class, it's reusable. I can put it in a class library. I can put it into different projects I'm working on. And with the proper configuration, it's going to be quite reusable. And I can now go out here and I can change my app.use to app.use middleware. Like that. And name routing middleware. Like that. And that's going to work exactly the same. It looks a little bit better. And this, as I said, cool, because we now got reusability. So I can move this middleware between different projects. But I'm not too happy about the registration here, because we're all used to registering middlewares like that, right? So you do app.use something. So I want this to be app.use name routing instead of having to have this use middleware and pass in the type and everything. And to do that, we need to do some very minor changes. So we need to add one more class. I'm going to add a middleware extensions, right? Like that. I'm going to make the class static, and I'm going to add an extension method here. I'm going to call it usename routing. So this thing here is going to be, the extension method is going to be named usename routing, and it's going to take an iApplication builder, and it's going to do the call to use middleware for me. Main thing here is a lot of people miss out on a very neat little feature, is that don't put it in your own namespace. move it to the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Builder namespace instead. Because if you move it to that namespace, which happens to be the same namespace that the AI application builder interface is located in, it means that whenever you come in here to your, if you had this in a separate assembly or in a NuGet package or something like that, since you always have this using statement up here, so it's already going to be in there. Whenever you go for app.use, it will automatically find name routing because it's in a namespace that you've already got. And that's the way that they do all of these extension methods for all the different middlewares that we're using. They just put them in the same namespace so they're easy to find. Now we've got this nice little use name routing. If I go back here, we can have it look and see that it actually still works. Actually, might be that I have to restart the application, sorry. We try Heady again, and there it is. So my name routing is still up and running. And I'm not saying that potentially having your routing engine being like this is an optimal solution, and it's obviously going to cause problems like the start page here is still going to have the wrong URLs and things like that. But the important thing to take away here is how easy it is to actually plug into the request pipeline. And we can do a bunch of really cool things because being that it's a low-level API that basically gets to look at every single incoming and outgoing request at a request level, it means that we can do things like rewrite it, we can make changes, we can intercept things, we can modify things. And everything that we're doing in ASP.NET Core is based around that idea. There's one little thing that they introduced. These middlewares that we're building, they are actually singletons. So whenever you register a middleware, it becomes a singleton by default. If you ever needed a middleware to be non-singleton, you had kind of like an issue because it wasn't supported previously. As of a fairly late version of ASP.NET Core, you can actually go and I know I told you didn't have to implement an interface, but for a non-singleton middleware, you can go in, you can implement an interface called iMiddleware. The iMiddleware is interesting because it causes you to make some changes. Obviously, first of all, the reference to the next delegate cannot be passed into the constructor because, well, that would make it impossible for you to reuse it. So what happens is that for a non-singleton middleware, we actually end up moving our request delegate down to our method instead down to our invoke async. Now that we have the same middleware, but it's implementing iMiddleware instead, and we've moved the request delegate down to the invoke async instead in the constructor. And finally, the last thing we need to do is we have to go up to our configure services and say services.add transient. And what we want to add is name routing middleware, like that. And once we've got that going, that's all we need to do. So if we go and we run this now, I put a breakpoint in here, you can see that it actually calls the constructor for every single request that comes in. So if I go for Eddie again, it news it up again. So you've broken away from the problem of having to be singleton, which actually causes some problems in certain middlewares. Just remember that depending on where you put your middleware in the request pipeline, you might have it being newed up very, very often, because in my case, I'm putting it after the static files, which is probably a good idea, because if I'm just requesting a static file like a CSS file or a GIF file or a PNG or whatever, then I probably don't need to put up my name routing. So there's no reason for me to initialize or create a new instance of that middleware. So remember, once you go away from singletons, you do have a little bit of a performance impact of it creating a new one for every single request that goes as far as your middleware. Okay, so now you've seen middlewares. Most of you have potentially seen that already, not a big deal. I'm going to try one more thing here. So my awesome source company, as every other company in the world, obviously has an API as well, right? So it has this API here at /API/user/1. I go send, it's going to make a request, and I'm going to get Hedy Lamar back. Fine, works as it should. But what if I go to my headers and I tell it that, hey, by the way, I want this to come back as XML. I know that everybody hates XML nowadays, but bear with me. Just say that, okay, I want to have XML. And then we put that in to accept text HTML. We send that, and I'm still getting JSON back. The reason that we're getting JSON back is that in recent versions, in .NET Core, I think it was different, if I don't remember it wrong, in classical MVC, they actually had the XML stuff already in place. For ASP.NET Core, it's actually not in place. So if you want to support both JSON and XML, what we need to do is we need to go into the startup, and in this here call to add controllers with views, we add this callback here. And in this callback, we can go ahead and we can write options.outputFormatters.add new, and this is going to be fun, XML serializer output formatter. Where can I, XML serializer output for, didn't spell that right, formatter. That's the one. So by just adding that, it adds what's called a formatter. So that formatter by default is going to look at or rather, there's another class that looks at what formatter to use. And that formatter, output formatter selector that is being used, will look at the accept header as the default. So if I run this now, you can see that I'm getting it back in XML. So I'm supporting both JSON and XML. Not a big deal, we've seen that before, but what happens when you pull up an API controller like this and you go, okay, so it's returning user, and you want to return something similar, but still it needs to be a little bit different. Say that you have changed the way that the user object is looking because you need a new version of it. I'm going to simulate that by adding a new version of user. I'm just going to add a models folder here. And in the models folder, I'm going to add a class. And I'm going to call it basic user. Just imagine that I need to create a version of the API where I can return a basic user. The basic user in this case is a smaller version of the user. It's just, it removes some of the information, so it just becomes a small version of that user. Now I have two versions of user, and I want to be able to support getting that new basic user as well. So I go ahead and I add another API endpoint here called getBasicUser, and it returns a basic user. So the main problem here, and this is where not having an audience to ask you to put up your hands is going to be annoying, but I assume that some of you have already realized that this is not going to work. If I tried running this, it will actually throw an exception because I have the same endpoint here. So it wouldn't know. It's actually going to give me, hey, you've got duplicate actions here. I don't know which one to use. I want to get around that because I kind of like the idea of being able to control what I'm getting back based on my accept header. So a very common way to do, this can be used for versioning or different, whatever you want to use it for. Versioning is a very common thing. And what you do is you say accept header, and then you add an application specific version of it. So I want to get, from this endpoint, I want to get an application/vnd.user. This is a completely made up string that I've just come up with, but there is like a standard where people are saying start with application/ and then vnd dot. That's indicating that I want to have a custom type being returned. It's not going to be XML. It's not going to be, I'm not defining XML or JSON. I'm actually asking a request type or a resource type. But the problem here is that ASP.NET Core has no idea about how to handle that. So we have to build something that supports doing that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to fix that. I'm going to go and I'm going to say add new folder, infrastructure. And in my infrastructure folder, I'm going to create a new class. And I'm going to call it accept header attribute. And it's going to look like this. That's the one that I want. So this class here, my accept header attribute, it inherits an attribute, which means that I'm allowed to decorate, in this case, I'm allowed to decorate a method with this attribute. And then I've told it that it implements IActionConstraint. So IActionConstraint comes out of ASP.NET Core, ASP.NET Core MVC. And what it does, it forces me to have these two things here. It requires me to have an accept method that returns Boolean and an order. So the accept method, it basically takes a context about the current request and then returns true or false whether or not this action is valid for the current incoming request. In my case, I'm doing something simple. I'm just saying that, hey, can I use this action for this request? Well, let's have a look at the context, route information, the HTTP context, the request, the passed in headers. Is there any header that starts with the accept header that I have defined? If there is, then it returns true, otherwise it returns false. And then order here is just so that you can get it to be evaluated in different order. We are not going to use that. It's just part of the IAction constraint. But having that, it means I can go to my user controller, and on this get basic user, I'm going to go and I'm going to add an accept header like that. I get accept header attribute, and it asks me, what's the accept header? Well, I did want to use application/vnd.user, right? So just adding that is now telling ASP.NET Core that whenever I make a request here to this endpoint here, and I'm passing along this header, it is going to ask for, basically find these two actions, and it's going to ask this action here first, are you okay with getting this request? And if the header is this, it's going to say yes, otherwise it's going to say no. And if it says no, it's going to use this, and if it says yes, it's going to use this. So running that means that if I send this request now, you're going to see that I'm now getting a small version of my head.lmr. If I remove that and I send the request again, I get the full version. You can imagine having this as a versioning scheme, right? You could pass in an application version instead and then get different things depending on the version, not a resource type. Another thing about this is that right now I'm stuck to doing JSON. Another common scenario that people like using is that you take the application via the user part, but then you add plus and then whatever formatting you want. So you want it as JSON or do you want it as XML? That is another part, because right now I have an action selector or this header attribute here that basically defines which action to run based on the header. But to actually format it, that's a different story. So to be able to support the idea of passing in this address here, which is application vnd user plus XML, I need to tell ASP.NET Core what that means. And the way that I do that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a new class, and I'm going to call it accept header output formatter selector. There it is. And it looks like this, accept header output formatter selector. So an output formatter selector is a base class for an ASP.NET MVC, and it is literally used for selecting the output formatter. By default, ASP.NET Core has one built in. It looks at the accept header, but it only knows about how to map your, map your XML to this thing here, and otherwise it uses JSON, basically. So what I've got is I'm building my own one of these, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a constructor to it. And in the constructor, I'm going to accept a couple of things. First of all, I want to get the options for MVC. So the object passed in here is the object that I'm configuring here. In that options, I can get a hold of a few things, like the defined output formatters that have been added, which in my case is going to be the XML serialized output formatter, and the JSON one, because I know that the JSON one is registered by default. And then I got a logger factory, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to store all of my output formatters so I can use those. And I'm going to go create a fallback selector. So if my selector can't handle it, I'm actually going to fall back to the one that MVC uses internally. So that means that I don't have to figure out all the weird scenarios that the ASP.NET team has already figured out. It's basically, I'll do my thing, and if it doesn't fit into what my selector is trying to do, then hey, go and do it the old-fashioned way like they do in ASP.NET Core automatically. And also, I've got a content type map here that basically just says JSON goes to that, the MIME type. So JSON goes to the MIME type that, and the XML goes to the MIME type of that type. So now that I've got my little thing set up, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to implement this. It's going to look like this. So this output formatter is going to look at the request header. So it's going to look at the context that gets passed in. It's going to say, is there an accept header that starts with application vnd dot? If not, then hey, use the fallback selector, ask ASP.NET Core how to format things. I don't really care. It's not my problem. If the accept header starts with that, it's just going to go and say, did somebody pass in a list of formatters? Because you can actually get that passed in as well. And if it wasn't passed in, if there weren't formatters passed in, I'm going to use the ones that I got from the constructor, basically the ones that got configured up here. Then I'm going to go and change the content type for my context based on a method that I'm going to show you in just a second. Then I'm going to ask my formatters, and I'm going to find the first formatter that can return a response based on the request with the new content type. Then I'm going to reset the content type back to the first accept header, and then I'm going to return the formatter. And the implementation here of the can get what's the name of that thing? Sorry, it's just get content. That's the one. And this method here, once again, looks at the accept header. It tries to locate a plus sign inside of the accept header. If there is one, it's going to cut off anything that's to the right of the plus sign, which is going to be, in my case, JSON or XML. And then it's going to have a look at my map here and say, if it's JSON, then return application JSON. If it's XML, return text XML, which basically means that what's going to happen here is that when I've passed in application/vnd.user plus XML, it's going to rewrite this to text XML, and then I'm going to ask any formatters that can handle that, and then I'm going to set it back to whatever I had to begin with. Now that I have an outputs formatter selector, all I need to do is I need to go and tell ASP.NET Core to use that. We do that once again by using the services. So I'm going to go services.add singleton, and it's going to be an output formatter selector. One of those, and it's going to be mapped to accept header output formatter selector like that. And I need to include that. So now, by doing this call here, after this call here, I'm replacing the one that ASP.NET uses internally and using my own version of it instead. With that in place, I can go back to Insomnia. I can make my call with VND user XML, and it comes back as my small object, the VND user version of the resource in XML format. I remove that and I pass in JSON. I get the same object with JSON. If I pass in nothing, I get the full object. I can get the full object in XML format, and I can get the small object default format as JSON as well. So using these little classes allows us to do a bunch of really cool things from an API point of view. Not necessarily very useful for MVC for the web, but if you're building APIs and doing REST APIs, being able to actually hook into the accept header and do different mappings based on that is actually very, very powerful. Okay, so now we've seen some formatting. One thing I've got that I want to show you in this project, I've got one more thing here, and that's, we go into, actually shouldn't have closed that. If we go into the user controller, I'm not too happy about this, actually, that's the user controller I want. It gets an integer passed in both of these, and in both cases, it goes and does the same thing. As developers, we're always taught that you should be dry, you should not repeat yourself. So having code, if I had had more versions of this or whatever, I would have had to have these calls all over the place. We can get away from that. There are other reasons for doing this, but it would be kind of nice to be able to write this instead, right? So much less code if I could just go and write this instead. Much cleaner, much nicer. I'm going to change it to be user. I'm going to go and remove that. I'm going to switch this away as well and just return a basic user. And I'm going to remove that call as well. Problem now is that ASP.NET Core has no idea how to serve that request or map it to a user. So I need to tell it how to do the model binding. So a very simple thing to do, or not very simple, but fairly simple. We go in and we create a user model binder. It's a model binder, and a user model binder looks like this. Basic model binder is a class that implements iModelBinder, which requires you to have a method called bindModelAsync that returns a task and takes a binding context. In my case, I'm also creating a constructor so I can get my users repository passed in. And the implementation here is bindModelAsync, that thing there. First thing, verify that the context is actually being passed in as it should. Next, here I'm doing a little tweak, and what I'm getting here from binding context.modelMetadata.name is actually the name of the parameter that I'm trying to bind. So this part here is going to say user. And then I'm going to, because that's what they're called here, then I'm going to take the user, I'm going to append ID automatically to it. So I'm just going to say that if the parameter in is called user, I'm going to turn the key into user ID. Then I'm going to ask the binding context, can you please give me and see if somebody has passed in a user ID parameter as a post argument or as a query parameter or whatever. If I don't get a user ID passed back, then I'm going to return nothing. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take the value that I get back, verify that it's not null or empty. Then I'm going to take that value, I'm going to try to parse it. So I'm going to say, take the user ID that somebody posted to me or added in a query string or added as a parameter in the URL, and try to parse that as an integer. If that doesn't work, add a model error and then basically just return and say, nope, didn't work, couldn't solve it. Otherwise, if it could parse it as an integer, go and ask the users for that user ID, find the user, and then tell the binding context that, hey, I was successful to do the binding for you. Here is the object that you should use. I take that and I go to my startup. Actually, we need one more thing, sorry. This is just a binder. We need something called a model binder provider as well. I'm going to create a user model binder provider. User model binder provider. So the model binder provider is like a company, a friend class to the model binder in the way that it takes a model binder context, a model binder provider context, and says, hey, can you please give me a model binder? We can register a bunch of these model binder providers, and all this thing it does, it looks at the model information and says, hey, are you trying to bind a user? In that case, I think you should use this model binder here. And no, I'm not actually giving it my model binder. I'm giving it a binder type model binder. I'm passing it in the type of my model binder. It is because this binder type model binder, it does dependency injection for me. And since I am doing dependency injection in my user model binder, you use this extra thing around it to support a dependency injection. Now that I have a model binder and a model binder provider, all I have to do is go to the services and register my model binder, not there, but in here. Let's say options.model binder providers, and here's a little tweak. You have to do insert 0 or whatever, but if you don't insert at the top, it actually goes in order, and it's going to make sure that the first one that it finds that returns a model binder is the one that it uses. And that is unfortunately, if you do an add, mine is going to end up at the end, and ASP.NET Core is always going to have one that says, I know how to do it. So we want to have this thing at the beginning. If I take this and we put a breakpoint here, F5, go into debugging. Doesn't really matter because I'm not doing that. And go to Insomnia and I press send here. And I set my breakpoint in the right one, that one. Send. You can now see that it's actually bounded straight to my object. So I don't have to get the ID and do the ID to object conversion on my own. I can actually have it bound to a real object straight away. There are some downsides to it. It makes it harder for you to figure out if stuff is failing. You cannot add your own error messages and things like that. So you need to get around that. And also, it's not really recommended to run off to a database, for example, which is kind of what I'm doing, because it might be slow. And that should potentially be done with inside of your action so you can handle error states and things like that. But it shows you that model binders can be a really powerful way of doing things as well. Okay, so I'm going to step away from my awesome source company, and I'm going to show you another company here, which is my enterprise employee management system. If we start that up, it's going to look like this. This is my Enterprise Employee Management Inc. I'm going to log in as Grace. And if we go to here, we can see that Grace can manage users. And one of the things you can do is you can add new users. So you can go and add another user here. It's going to be Jane Doe, who's a CEO. And that's awesome, works fine. And it's got security. I have to log in. And if we look at the controller here for my employees controller, it uses authorize. So it should be all safe, right? Shouldn't be any problems with anything here. I can't get to this without being logged in. Then, unfortunately, our dear friend Grace browses to our Evil Hackster site. Evil Hackster site, she refreshes that, and that's not going to work. Damn it, that was supposed to work nicely. I'm just going to start that up for you. I'm going to start my Evil Hackster site, and it loads up and nothing really happens. And like we can refresh that a couple of times, nothing really happens. And then Grace comes back to her work site again, and all of a sudden, why is this not working now? So let's start a project. There's something with my machine today that is not working properly. I don't know why. Sorry. This was supposed to do a really sweet thing, and it does. It does call add. Now I know. Let's just try and log out. I'm just going to log back in again and see if this works now. Sorry. Oh, come on. There it is. I'm going to take my Evil Hackster site, add that here, browse to that. Once again, refresh a couple of times, go back to this thing here, and there, now it's working. Don't know quite. Oh yeah, I know why. It has to do with the way that my browsers are set up, 2 different accounts. Anyhow, what happens here is that all of a sudden I have Evil Hackster all over the place. And what is really happening is in this site here, I'm doing some cross-site request forgery. So if we look at the network, when I load this, it actually loads an Hackster form.html that does a post to the employee's add endpoint. And due to the fact that I'm already logged in here, I am authenticated because the browser is nice enough to add the cookie for me and I'm automatically logged in. This does not work in Chrome, by the way, because Chrome has fixed their cookie handling, so it would actually block it for you. But for all other browsers, this is still a problem. I can still go and do very simple request forgeries and get stuff being put in like this. But with ASP.NET Core, you really should never have that problem. Because if we go to the form, and if we do an inspect here, and we zoom, you can see here that inside of my form, there's actually a request verification token being added. Whenever you add a form in ASP.NET Core, you actually get request forgery checks built in. So basically, whenever you use a form, in my case, the view looks like this. Whenever you use a form like this, ASP.NET Core automatically adds that request forgery check for us. The only thing we need to do is we need to go into our code, go to the add method and say validate anti-forgery token, like that. Not a very big deal to do, but once you've got that going, if we refresh this site now, let's go back to the home page, it's going to have lost everything because it's just an in-memory database. But if I go to Evil Hackster site and I refresh this now, you can see that it goes red, it goes 400. And the reason for that is that the Evil Hackster site doesn't have the anti-request forgery stuff that's needed to do it. But if I go in here and I go and create a new user, it's still going to work fine because it validates everything that's needed. I wouldn't really recommend doing validate anti-forgery tokens like this. What you want to do instead is that whenever you start an ASP.NET application, you want to go into your ASP.NET configuration here in Add Controllers. You want to go and say options, and all you need to do is say options.filters.add, which adds a global filter that is for every single request. And then you add an auto validate anti-forgery token attribute. Once you've got that, it will actually add anti-forgery checks for every risky HTTP verb that you've got. So every time you're passing in a post or a patch or a put or a delete, it will actually verify that you have anti-forgery tokens in place. Otherwise, it won't work. And all you need is that one line of code and you're good to go. And it works with single page applications as well. The last thing I want to show in this project here is that, as you can see, we can add profile pictures. Problem with profile pictures is that we never know how big they are, right? So we need to have a way to create thumbnails. Thumbnails is a resource-intensive thing to do, and it would be kind of nice if we could do those in the background so that didn't interrupt our actual application. So I'm going to go and I'm going to create a background process for that. So I'm going to add a new folder called infrastructure. And in my infrastructure folder, I'm going to create what I call a thumbnail generator. Like that. Nope. Generator. Yes. And the implementation is actually not that complicated. It is what's called an IHostedService. An IHostedService is a class that supports start async and stop async. And it's going to run in the background inside of your ASP.NET process. The only thing I need here is I need to have a thumbnail generator constructor, because I need a few things. I need the hosting environment that I'm working at the moment. I need my employees. I need to have a file system watcher to get everything working. Once I've got those things, in the start async, I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to make sure that there's a folder in the www folder called images/employees. And then I'm going to add a file system watcher that listens to files being created inside of that folder. Whenever a file is being created, I'm going to call a method called file created. That looks like this. Actually, I'm not going to cover the file as such, or this method very much, but what it does, it looks at the file name, it finds out the tenant name and employee ID from the naming of the file, and then it basically uses, sorry, I need a NuGet package here called image sharp. Image sharp, that thing there. It uses image sharp to basically create a thumbnail. And use that, and then that is an extension method. There it is. So it's basically just create a thumbnail for me, but it runs in the background, which is kind of cool. And then for the stop, I'm going to have a stop async, and all that does, it basically unhooks the event handler, it disables racing events, and it disposes the file system watcher. Once I have one of these iHosted services, I can go to my services collection, and I can say services.add hosted service. I'm going to add a thumbnail generator, one of those, like that. Wow, like that. Come on, thumbnail generator, that's one. So now I have this thumbnail generator thing running, and if I start my application, actually I'm going to put a breakpoint in file created here. I'm going to go F5, so I'm attaching a debugger. And here we can see I'm going to go add profile picture. I'm going to upload a profile picture. That's some form of image here. That. Upload. You can see it jumps straight in here, which is cool. I can go F5 and it comes back again, and this time it is the thumbnail that's going, because it says that the first image being created is 1-1-John-Doe, and then it creates a thumbnail, and due to the fact that I'm creating a thumbnail, it gets called again because it's looking for every single file being created in there. But you can see that I'm actually in here blocking my thread right now, and if I go back out here, I've already got my response back. So the actual code or image generation is being done in a background thread. So if I let this run through, and if I refresh this page here, my thumbnail comes up in the background when I'm done with it. So if you have like slow, long-running tasks, you can have them in a background thread using a hosted service in a very simple way, which solves a bunch of really cool and interesting problems. Okay. That was kind of the intro to things you can do in ASP.NET Core. That's not hyper complicated. A lot of people have already seen it. The next one is a bit more complicated. So I looked at Azure and web apps. And if you go into Windows Azure or Microsoft Azure and you go into web apps, there's a little tick box that you can say add application insights. And magically, application insights is now part of your application. I was sort of thinking, how do they actually do that? How do they extend my application with application insights code without me adding any code into my application? And that is kind of what I want to show you. You can actually extend applications with code without having to modify your own code, which means that when you're deploying to not only Azure, but to your own servers, you can make sure that every web application deployed to your server will automatically incorporate a bunch of features that you have defined. Application Insights is just one of those common scenarios that a lot of people know that, hey, a little tick box and magically it has functionality. You can do the same. So what I've got is I've got something I call request diagnostics. Really stupid example. It's got a diagnostics log class. All it really does is that it has a log method that takes a string. It stores the strings in a dictionary, a list. And then it uses iApplication lifetime to figure out when the application is stopping. And whenever the application is stopping, then I tell the file here to write my logs to a physical file. And whenever the application starts up, it reads the log messages in again. So it's basically just a stupid in-memory list of log entries that gets persisted between application starts. Do not implement this in production in any way. It's dumb and it causes problems and it's a massive memory leak in every single way. But I just want to show you an example of something. So this diagnostics log is one part of my system. The other part is a diagnostics middleware. So this middleware plugs in and gives you a request endpoint called /diagnostics. And if you go to /diagnostics and you are in development, development environment, it is going to output all of the log entries to you on screen as a text file. That's it. These are the two things that I want to plug into my application. And oh yeah, sorry, it does a logging thing here. So it logs everything for every request and things somewhere. Anyhow, this is kind of cool. Just curious as to. Ignore me. This is what I want to extend my application with. So I want to have this login interface, and I want to have my endpoint here, my middleware. And how do I actually extend my application without actually going into my application and adding a reference to this class here? That was kind of the big problem that I was facing. And the first thing I figured out is that you can create something called a startup filter. I'm going to add a new class, and I'm going to call it diagnostics startup filter. If I could spell diagnostics startup filter. There it is. And it's going to look like this: diagnostic startup filter. So a startup filter is just a class that implements iStartup filter. That's it. iStartup filter has one method called configure. And if you look at what gets passed in, it's an iApplication builder. So this is a service that you can register in DI that gets to play along in your startup class here. So if you have an iApplication startup, an iStartup filter in your application's dependency IOC container, whenever you get to this configure part here, it is going to call configure on this startup filter, allowing me to register middlewares in my request pipeline. So that's part number one of this. And it also just adds a little console write line so I can see that it's actually being plugged in. So that iStartup filter allows me to plug into the request pipeline. Then there's another one that I'm going to add another one in here called diagnostics hosting startup, diagnostics hosting startup. So a hosting startup is a class that implements IHostedService. It in turn has a configure method as well, but it takes a web host builder. And this application if you have one of these, it gets to play along with this part of your application, which is the startup of your application. So in your program CS. So whenever you build your web host, we can plug into that. And what I'm doing in this is that when I set up my web host, I go and I register 2 services in my application. So I add my diagnostics log and I add my startup filter. Once that gets added to my IOC container, when it gets to the configure method of the startup, it's going to go and it's going to run my startup filter, and the startup filter is going to plug itself into the request pipeline. Last thing I need to do is I need to make sure that the assembly that contains my hosting startup needs to have an assembly attribute called hosting startup that points at the class that implements IHostedService. These are the 2 parts that I need. Now that I have that, I want to start extending my application with this, because now I have all the building parts. And the way that I want to do this, I want to use something called a Runtime Store. So .NET Core, or ASP.NET Core, I think it's .NET Core in general, implements something called a Runtime Store, which basically allows you to take a bunch of DLLs and put them in a location on a hard drive, and then point to that location and download DLLs from there. It's kind of like a global assembly cache without all the downside of a global assembly cache. But it allows you to, on a server, for example, prepare that server with a bunch of DLLs that your application needs to have, and then it can be stored on the server so that it can be loaded by your application without your application having to bring everything along. So what I've done is I've created this project here called Runtime Store. And the only reason that I have a project here is because I need to get a CS proj file. I have this CS proj file. All it does, it changes where it finds NuGet packages. It takes all the ones that are available, adds NuGet, and then adds a folder inside of the own project. And then it has a reference to request diagnostics. That's my project. The first thing I need to do is I need to generate my request diagnostics NuGet package. And I'm going to do that by pulling up a PowerShell window. And I'm going to go around and run .NET hack like that. I'm just packing my request diagnostics project into a NuGet package. And what happens now is it put the NuGet package inside of deployment packages request diagnostics NuGet, so that this package references that NuGet package in that folder. Next part I need to do is I need to create what is called the Runtime Store. And what you do with the Runtime Store is you have this CS proj file, then you go out and you run .NET Store. You give it a manifest, which is your CS proj file with the package reference inside of it. You tell it what runtime it's going to be running on. I'm running on a Windows 10 machine. You tell it where to put the store, and in this case, I'm skipping optimization. I run that. What's going to happen now is it's going to gather up all of the assemblies needed to be able to run this project here, which happens to be, it needs that NuGet package, but that NuGet package in turn has dependencies and other thing. And it's going to generate a folder here, or a folder structure, that basically contains all of the assemblies needed. You can see all the DLLs in here, to be able to run the request diagnostics package. All of those assemblies are now loaded up and placed into this folder here called store, in a very specific format with the x64 and .NET Core App 3.1 and so on and so on. Now I have a store. The last part I need something called a deps, or additional deps. So whenever we build an application, so I'm going to go and say .NET publish. I'm going to go and publish my Runtime Store application. I'm just going to publish it to a temporary folder because I don't actually need that project. All I need is when you build an ASP.NET application or a .NET application, you get this file here called deps.json. It contains all of the dependencies that should get loaded together with your application. So I want that thing there, but I don't want it to have a reference to the actual project itself. I'm going to go ahead in 2 places here. I'm just going to remove the reference to itself and just keep all of the other references, all of the other things that it needed. So now I have that runtime store deps.json file. I'm just going to go and I'm going to copy that. I'm going to do a copy from deployment temp runtime store deps.json And I'm going to copy that to deployments, additional deps, shared, blah, 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 which if we go in here and have a look, is a very specific path. So the additional deps, that's my folder, but the shared Microsoft ASP.NET Core app is basically the shared library that my application will be based on. And then the version of the shared library that I'm using, or shared framework, and then my request diagnostics.deps.json, which is telling it that if you ever want to load, if you have an application built on that shared framework that needs to load request diagnostics, then please go ahead and load all of these other dependencies as well. This is a bit hard to get your head around, maybe by me just explaining it. It took me a while to read up on and figure out, but what I've got now is I've got everything I need to dynamically load things. So what I need to do, last step, is I need to set up some environment variables. And if I open up my web application, the one that I want to extend, and I go into the properties folder and the launch settings, I'm going to go into this thing here. I'm going to go and add a couple of environment variables. First of all, I'm adding this additional deps. So .NET additional deps is telling .NET that whenever you start this application, or an application that has this environment variable, please have a look inside of this folder for additional dependencies. It's going to look in here, and it's going to figure out that the application that I'm loading is based on this shared framework here. So it's going to look into this folder here, and it's going to say, ooh, there's additional dependencies saying that if you are loading request diagnostics, please go and load these dependencies as well. Then I'm going to set up a .NET shared store, which is another environment variable that points towards my store. That's telling ASP.NET or .NET that if you're looking for assemblies, please look not only in the local folder for the application, but please go ahead and look into these assemblies as well. There might be other assemblies here that's not in the local folder. Please load them from this location instead. So it's basically pointing to the same place. And then finally, you add this ASP.NET Core hosting startup assemblies telling ASP.NET Core that whenever this an application loads, it should load this as an assembly called request diagnostics. It has some hosting startup stuff for me. So what's going to happen is I'm going to start the application. ASP.NET Core is going to see that. It's going to say, hey, I want to load request diagnostics. Request diagnostics is not part of my application, but it's going to go and look in the shared store. Then it's going to find the shared store and going to say, hey, I can see request diagnostics in here. I'm going to load that file. The problem is that when it tries to load request diagnostics from the store, it's not going to have all of the dependencies needed to run it because they're not bundled together, so to say. They're external dependencies. So then it's going to say, hey, I can also see in additional dependencies that you're trying to load this thing here. It requires me to also load all of these other assemblies to work. So in the end, this, with all of my talk and all of my code and all of the environment variables and things, means that if I run this as a console app, come on, we'll stop this thing here. I get this console here, and here is the magical part. And you see, I don't know if you can see this, but it says adding generic diagnostics to system. Diagnostics available at diagnostics. If I go to /diagnostics, you can see that it's actually taking care of every incoming request, adding it to my diagnostics. And if I go ahead and I stop my application, you will now see that, give me a second. Open folder in File Explorer. I didn't actually write out my log. It should write out my log as well. I don't know why it. It's probably because I killed it in the wrong way. Let's see if I just run this one more time. If I can get the logs to actually get. If I cancel that instead of killing it, you get the logs here. So it did write out the logs for me as well. So this way, any application in my system on my local machine that has these environment variables set up, which is you set them on the environment, not in your launch settings file normally, it means that they get loaded in, and I can extend every single web app in my application by just putting them on my local machine. I think I'm pretty close to what the time I was allotted to actually talk to you guys. I know that there was a lot of code and a lot of things to have a look at, so I put all of the code on GitHub. It does include a bunch of information. So if you go to the address, which is, actually I can go github.com, that thing there, we have a look at that. There is so you're not just stuck with me explaining it, and you can try a bunch of different things with the code that I've had. Other than that, I just want to thank you all for listening. I hope you got something out of it and that you have something that you can play around with after the conference. Thank you so much.